I still don't know if anyone will believe this. Sometimes I'm not even sure I believe it myself, but I feel like I need to get it out. Finally tell the full story. It happened 5 years ago, right before Thanksgiving. I've kept quiet about it ever since. But now, with so much time passed, maybe it's time. It started innocently enough, the way these things always seem to. I was a college student, broke and exhausted, just trying to make it to Thanksgiving break. That year had been rough. Midterms had been brutal. I was working 2 part-time jobs to cover books, bills, and food, and I was counting down the days until I could be back home with my family, even if just for a few days. That is when it happened. 2 days before I planned to drive home for Thanksgiving, my car decided to die on me. I had just finished my last class of the week and was ready to head back to my dorm to pack when, out of nowhere, the engine made a low grinding sound. The next thing I knew, it sputtered and stalled right there in the parking lot. I tried turning the key again, but nothing, just the lifeless click of a dead engine. I sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, my stomach sinking. This wasn't some minor issue I could ignore. I called for a tow and had it taken to the nearest shop, hoping it wouldn't be as bad as I feared. But when the mechanic gave me the news, my worst suspicions were confirmed. "You need a new transmission," he said, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "And it's not going to be cheap. We're talking $4,000 for parts and labor, and I'm going to need you to prepay for the transmission ahead of time." I felt the weight of those words hit me like a punch. My heart sank even further. "How long will it take?" "Well," the mechanic scratched his chin. "Parts are back-ordered with the holiday and all. We're looking at a few weeks before we can even get it in, let alone install it." I stared at him, trying to process the situation. Thanksgiving was in 2 days, and I was supposed to be driving home. I checked my bank account, feeling sick as I realized I had just enough money to cover the cost of the transmission. But after that, I'd only have a couple $100s in my account and $50 in my wallet. I hesitated, but what choice did I have? I dipped into my savings and handed over my card, feeling the loss of every last dollar. Once I paid, the reality of it all sunk in. My car wasn't going to be ready in time. There was no way I'd make it home to my family by Thanksgiving. My parents called me soon after I got back to my dorm room. I answered the call while staring out at the gray November sky, watching the leaves blow across the empty quad. "Can't wait to have you home, Cam," my mom said. "Everyone's excited to see you." "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. "I'm looking forward to it too." It wasn't just the usual family reunion I was looking forward to. My mom was making meatloaf, my favorite. She'd been talking about it for weeks, and every time she did, it made my mouth water. My dad was trying out some new smoked turkey recipe, and my younger sister had already texted me a picture of the dessert she was planning to make. In a way, I needed that. A reminder of home, of something familiar and safe. "We've got a houseful coming," my mom continued, her voice warm and filled with that holiday excitement. "Aunt Carol, Uncle Jim, all the cousins. It's going to be a big one." "Yeah, sounds great," I said, but my stomach twisted. I hadn't told them about my car yet. How was I going to break it to them that I wasn't even sure if I'd make it home? That I'd be stuck on campus, spending the holiday alone while my family gathered without me? I couldn't tell them that, though. Not over the phone, and definitely not right before the holiday. My parents would have tried to fix everything, would have driven hours to pick me up, and I didn't want to put that burden on them. "Anything else I should bring?" I asked, trying to change the subject. "Nope," my dad chimed in. "Just yourself. Oh, and your appetite." We laughed, but it felt hollow. After I hung up with my parents, guilt settled in. The weight of everything came crashing down on me. I sat there on my bed, staring at the wall, trying to figure out how the hell I was going to make it home. Flights were out of the question. Everything was sold out or too expensive. Same with the trains and buses. Besides, they wouldn't get me home in time at this point anyway. That pretty much killed all my options. I was stuck. But then, in a moment of desperation, I remembered the college's online message board. Students used it to post everything from textbook sales to ride shares, especially around the holidays. I wasn't exactly hopeful, but I figured it couldn't hurt to try. I put up a quick post, asking if anyone was heading in the direction of my hometown and had room for an extra passenger. I didn't expect much. It was late, and most people had already left campus for the break. Still, I left my phone on the nightstand, hoping for some kind of miracle. Later that night, just as I was about to call it quits, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it, my heart pounding, and saw that someone had replied to my post. It was a girl named Melissa, who I recognized from a few classes. She said she was heading to the same town for Thanksgiving and needed someone to help with the drive. Her friend had bailed last minute, leaving her to make the 12-hour trip alone. I couldn't believe it. It was perfect. We exchanged a few quick messages, agreeing to split the gas and driving. I was so relieved I could have cried. I wasn't going to miss Thanksgiving after all. I'd be home. The next morning, I met Melissa in the student parking lot. She was standing by a bright red Jeep Wrangler, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. I recognized her from around campus. She was in one of my classes, but we'd never really talked before. "Hey, Cam, right?" she asked, giving me a warm smile. "Yeah, Melissa?" "Yep, that's me. You ready for this?" She gestured to the Jeep. "It's a long drive, but at least we'll have each other for company." I nodded, throwing my bag into the back. "Thanks again for this. You really saved me." "Don't mention it," she said, climbing into the driver's seat. I could use the help with driving anyway. There was no way I could drive 12 hours all by myself. We pulled out of the parking lot and hit the road, the sun just starting to rise behind us. For a while, we drove in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't feel awkward or forced. After a few hours, the small talk started to flow more naturally. We talked about school, what classes we were taking, the usual stuff. It turned out we lived only a few minutes away from each other, but we'd gone to different high schools. Melissa had gone to a private school on the other side of town, which explained why we'd never crossed paths before college. "So, you excited to go home?" she asked, glancing over at me. "Yeah, definitely," I said. "I haven't been home in months. My mom's making my favorite meatloaf. Sounds lame, but it's a tradition." She laughed. "Hey, no judgment. My mom's making her famous pumpkin pie. I've been dreaming about it for weeks." We fell into an easy rhythm, talking about our families, our holiday plans, and what we were looking forward to. She told me about her brother, who was in the military, and how this was the first time in years that the whole family would be together. I told her about my little sister who'd already sent me pictures of the dessert she was making for Thanksgiving dinner. It felt good talking to her like that, like the drive wouldn't be so bad after all. But as we continued down the interstate, everything started to go wrong. Traffic slowed to a crawl, then to a complete stop. We were stuck in the middle of a massive backup, cars stretched out as far as we could see. Hours passed and we barely moved. The sun started to dip below the horizon, and a deep sense of dread settled over me. Melissa sighed and looked down at the gas gauge. "We're running low," she muttered. I followed her gaze and saw the needle hovering dangerously close to empty. "There's no way we'll make it to the next exit," I said, feeling the first prickles of anxiety. Melissa nodded, biting her lip. "We're gonna have to get off this road. Find gas somewhere else." I didn't argue. The last thing we needed was to run out of gas in the middle of a gridlocked highway. That's when Melissa did something unexpected. She shifted the Jeep into four-wheel drive and veered off the road, down an embankment and into a wide open field. The Jeep bounced over the uneven ground, but Melissa handled it like a pro. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked, gripping the door handle as we sped through the field. "I saw a road over there," she said, nodding toward the horizon. "If we can get to it, maybe we can find a gas station." It was risky, but we didn't have much of a choice. The road she was aiming for was barely visible, just a thin strip of asphalt cutting through the trees. If we could make it, maybe we'd be able to find a gas station, get out of this mess, and get back on track. We bounced and jolted through the field, the Jeep handling it like a champ. But as we reached the road and started driving, the gas light came on. I pulled out my phone, trying to find the nearest station. But of course, we were in the middle of nowhere. No signal, no maps, nothing. "Great," I muttered. "What now?" Melissa didn't answer. She just kept driving, her eyes focused on the darkening road ahead. And then, as if by some miracle, we saw it. A small wooden sign on the side of the road, painted with the words, "Gas this way," and an arrow pointing to a side road. We exchanged a look. It was our only option. Melissa turned onto the road, and after about 10 minutes of driving through dense, dark forest, we spotted lights in the distance. A gas station. For a moment, it felt like we'd been saved. We pulled into the gas station with a sense of relief that washed over us like warm water. It seemed like a godsend after the long, tense hours on the road, and the flashing neon open sign felt like a beacon in the dark. It was an old place, really old, with peeling paint on the building's wooden exterior, weathered pumps that looked like they hadn't been updated in decades, and a flickering fluorescent light above the convenience store door. But it was lit up. The place looked operational, and right then, that was all that mattered. Melissa parked the Jeep right next to pump number 1, and for the first time in hours, we let ourselves exhale. "I'll fill it up," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt. "You go use the bathroom." Melissa nodded, looking a bit tired after the hours we'd spent crawling through the dark back roads with no gas stations or exits in sight. "Thanks," she said, stretching her arms as she climbed out of the car. "I won't be long." She headed toward the convenience store as I approached the pump. I pulled my wallet out of my jacket and tried to figure out where to insert my card. The pump was ancient, older than anything I'd ever seen. No digital screens, no place to swipe a card, just rusty dials and levers. I stood there for a second, squinting in the dim light as I fumbled with the nozzle, trying to see if I'd missed something. There was nothing. This pump was definitely not taking cards. I sighed and headed toward the convenience store, figuring I'd have to pay inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and as I stepped inside, the warmth hit me like a wave. But so did a strange, oppressive silence. The place was dead quiet. It wasn't just that it was empty. There wasn't a soul behind the counter, no clerk, no other customers. The shelves were stocked with chips and drinks, and the soft buzz of a refrigerator hummed in the background, but there was an unsettling stillness that hung in the air, thick and heavy. I walked up to the counter and glanced around. "Hello?" I called out, hoping someone would come out from the back. Nothing. I tapped my fingers on the counter, waiting, but the longer I stood there, the more the silence gnawed at me. I leaned over the counter to peer into the back room. Just a dim, empty space with boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. No sign of anyone. Then, the bathroom door creaked open, and Melissa stepped out, nearly causing my heart to jump out of my chest. "Sorry," she said with a nervous laugh, putting a hand on her chest. "I didn't mean to scare you." I forced a chuckle, but something still felt off. "Yeah, it's fine. But there's no one here." Her eyes flicked around the store, the same unease creeping into her expression. "You didn't see anyone?" I shook my head. "I've called out, but nothing. I was just about to leave cash on the counter and pump the gas anyway." Melissa nodded, glancing out the window toward the pumps. "I guess if they're open, someone's got to be around, right?" We both stood there for a moment longer, the tension between us unspoken but palpable. The shelves were stocked, the lights were on, but there was this feeling deep in my gut that we weren't supposed to be there. I shrugged it off. "Screw it. I'll just turn the pump on. It'll be fine." I headed behind the counter. I flipped the switch for pump number 1, set it for $40, and left the money in the empty cash register, hoping whoever ran the place would find it later. When I opened the register to leave the money, I noticed that it was completely empty. No bills, no receipts, nothing. Just dust. I stepped back outside, feeling that gnawing sense of dread crawl up my spine. Melissa stayed by the door, her eyes scanning the parking lot and the dark woods that surrounded the station. The wind had picked up, rustling the nearby trees, and the temperature seemed to drop even more, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. The gas pumped slowly, each gallon ticking by at an agonizing pace. The wind howled, and the leaves swirled on the road, creating an eerie whistling sound. I zipped up my jacket to keep the cold from completely invading me. The old country song crackled through the speakers outside, startling both of us as the twangy guitar filled the empty air. It was an odd, eerie sound in the dead of night, as if the music didn't quite belong, like it was coming from somewhere far away in time. And then, I saw them. It took a moment for my brain to register what I was seeing, and at first, I thought I was imagining it. But no. There they were, standing just beyond the tree line, motionless. Figures, dark and indistinct, barely illuminated by the dim glow of the gas station's flickering lights. Men, women, children, all standing there in the shadows, their faces barely visible, staring straight at us. I felt a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I'd just been plunged into ice water. My hand instinctively tightened on the gas pump nozzle, my pulse pounding in my ears. They weren't moving, just watching. "Melissa," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the old country song. "Do you see them?" She was leaning against the Jeep, scrolling through her phone. But when she looked up, her eyes followed my gaze to the figures. Her breath hitched. "What the hell?" she murmured, her voice trembling. They were getting closer. Slowly, silently, they stepped out from the trees and onto the edge of the gas station's lot. The way they moved made my skin crawl. It wasn't like normal people walking. It was stiff, jerky, almost unnatural, like puppets being pulled along on invisible strings. The gas pump was still clinking along, painfully slow. The light on the dial was dim, barely illuminating the old numbers as they rolled over, gallon by agonizing gallon. "Are they coming this way?" Melissa asked, her voice shaking. She was standing up straight now, her entire body tense. I nodded slowly, too stunned to speak. My eyes were fixed on the figures, and I could feel my heart beating faster and faster. They weren't running. They weren't rushing us. But the steady, deliberate way they moved was somehow worse. They moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly what they were doing, exactly what they wanted. The gas pump clicked off, signaling the tank was full. The sound was louder than it should have been, cutting through the eerie silence like a gunshot. I forced myself to move, my fingers trembling as I slowly unhooked the nozzle and replaced it on the pump. I couldn't take my eyes off the figures. They were close enough now that I could see their faces, but it was their eyes that stopped me cold. Black. Completely, utterly black. No whites, no pupils. Just endless dark voids staring back at us, their faces frozen in unnatural smiles. It was as if their expressions were stuck, twisted into something resembling friendliness but with no emotion behind it. Hollow. Dead. Melissa gasped, backing up toward the driver's side door of the Jeep. "Cam, what the hell is wrong with their eyes?" "I don't know," I whispered, my throat tight. "Get in the Jeep. Now." I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, not wanting to provoke them. Something deep inside me told me that if I ran, if I showed fear, it would trigger some type of predatory response in them. Melissa, clearly terrified, did the same, moving in a slow, tense motion as she reached for the driver's side door. The figures were getting closer. They were only a few yards away now, moving in a slow, steady advance. I could see them more clearly. Their clothes looked old, out of place. A tall man in a thick, ragged coat. A woman in a torn dress, with a young boy holding her hand. All of them with those black, bottomless eyes and those grotesque, frozen smiles. We both slid into the Jeep, closing the doors as quietly as possible. Melissa shoved the key into the ignition and twisted it. The engine sputtered. "Come on," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. She turned the key again, harder this time. The Jeep sputtered again but refused to start. The figures were only a few feet away now, surrounding the Jeep. Their black eyes locked on us, their cold smiles never wavering. Melissa frantically twisted the key again. "Come on, come on!" Nothing. The tall man with the thick beard reached out and knocked gently on the driver's side window. His hand lingered there, tapping softly on the glass with his knuckles. "You all right in there?" he asked, his voice calm, almost polite. His breath fogged the glass. "Need some help?" I felt my chest tighten, and I could see Melissa's hands shaking as she tried the key again. The Jeep remained dead. Another figure, a small girl, stepped closer to my window. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her face pressed against the glass. "Please," she said in a soft, almost sing-song voice. "It's so cold out here. Can we come inside?" The gas station's lot seemed to shrink around us, the figures getting closer with every heartbeat. Another woman, with long, stringy hair and a vacant expression, appeared on my side, pressing her hands against the window. "You don't want to leave us out here, do you?" she asked, her black eyes gleaming in the dim light. "It's so lonely." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare, my heart hammering in my chest as the Jeep filled with the sound of our own panicked breathing. Then, the big guy with the beard knocked again, this time harder. His smile widened unnaturally, stretching too far across his face, as if someone was pulling his mouth into a grin. "Open the door," he said, his voice still calm but more forceful. "We just need a ride." The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Melissa tried the key one last time, her hands trembling as she twisted it. The Jeep's engine refused to turn over. "They're going to break the windows," she whispered, her voice shaky with panic. I grabbed her arm. "We need to get out of here, now." Without another word, I unlocked my door, threw it open, and scrambled out of the Jeep. The door hit the little black-eyed girl, knocking her over with a solid thud. Melissa followed close behind, slamming the passenger door shut just as one of the figures reached for her. We both sprinted toward the gas station's convenience store, Melissa fumbling with the keys in her hand as we ran, locking the Jeep. I reached the door first and yanked it open. We stumbled inside, slamming the heavy door behind us, and I twisted the lock with trembling hands. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The sound of knocking continued, but now it was against the store's glass windows. Melissa backed away from the door, her eyes wide with fear. "They're still out there." I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. The figures had surrounded the store, their black eyes pressed against the glass, their faces twisted into those sick, unnatural smiles. They were everywhere, their breath fogging the windows as they stared in at us. I could hear them speaking, their voices soft and pleading, but with something deeply wrong behind them. "Let us in," the tall man said, his voice muffled through the glass. "It's cold out here. You don't want us to freeze, do you?" A young boy, no older than 10, pressed his face against the window beside the door. "We just need a ride. Please, mister, let us in." Another figure, a woman with tangled hair and wild eyes, stared at us through the glass with her head tilted. "Can you help us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's so dark out here." Their voices overlapped, blending into a sickening chorus of pleas, each one more twisted than the last. A small girl in a ragged dress stared at me through the window, her pale face inches from the glass. "Please," she whispered, her voice high-pitched and eerie. "Can we come in? Just for a little while?" The tall man with the beard stepped closer to the door, his fists pounding against it now, The sound reverberated through the store, sharp and heavy, the glass shaking with each blow. His voice was louder, angrier. "Let us in." I saw the glass begin to splinter under the force of his pounding. Thin cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, the door trembling under the weight of his fists. "Cam, they're going to get in," Melissa cried, her voice trembling with panic. I grabbed her hand. "Back here, now." We bolted toward the back of the store, darting past the empty shelves and into the employees-only section. I threw open a door that led to a small, cluttered office. I slammed the door, locking it. Looking around the room, the walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a desk sat in the middle of the room, papers strewn across it. Melissa ran over to the desk phone, frantically dialing, but when she lifted the receiver, her face went pale. "It's dead," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me with the desk." We both pushed the desk up against the door, blocking it, knowing the eventuality of them breaking into the store in pursuit of us. I could hear the pounding on the front door getting louder, the sound of glass cracking, ready to shatter at any moment. The voices were closer now, more urgent, more demanding. The tall man's voice rang out above the others, his fists slamming against the door. "We just need a ride. Let us in. Let us in." The sounds of the doors splintering under the pressure were getting louder, and I knew we didn't have much time. I glanced around the office, searching for an escape, and then I saw it. A door in the back corner marked "Maintenance." I ran over and yanked it open, revealing a narrow mechanical room with a ladder leading up to a small hatch in the ceiling. "This way," I shouted, motioning for Melissa to follow. We climbed up the ladder as fast as we could, the pounding growing louder behind us. Just as I reached the top, I heard the sound of shattering glass from the front of the store. They were in. They were inside the store. I pulled Melissa up after me, slamming the hatch shut behind us. We were now on the roof, the cold night air biting at our skin. I used my belt to lock the hatch in place, praying it would hold. We crept across the roof, crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. From up there, we could see them. The black-eyed people were swarming the store below, their hollow voices echoing through the night as they moved through the aisles, searching for us. "Cam," Melissa whispered, her voice shaky. "Look at my Jeep." I looked over to see that it was standing all alone next to pump number 1. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. We crawled to the edge of the roof, and I lowered myself down, holding onto the trim before dropping the last 6 feet to the ground. The impact jolted me, but I was okay. I motioned for Melissa to follow, and she dropped down into my arms. We both tumbled to the ground, breathless but unhurt. And that's when we saw her. Standing by the front door of the store, staring directly at us, was the young girl from earlier. Her head was tilted at that same unnatural angle, and her mouth slowly stretched into a wide, eerie grin. For a moment, she didn't move, just stood there, watching us with those empty black eyes. Then she opened her mouth and let out a scream, an ear-piercing, inhuman sound that shattered the night air. The others turned toward us, their black eyes locking onto us as they began to move. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Melissa's hand. We sprinted for the Jeep, our feet pounding against the pavement as the figures closed in. I threw open the passenger side door as Melissa jumped in the driver's seat, her hand shaking as she jammed the key into the ignition. I turned to see the black-eyed figures squeezing and forcing themselves through the convenience store door to come after us. The ones to make it through the doors leading back to the parking lot began to sprint towards the Jeep. I turned back to Melissa. "We gotta go." The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. Melissa floored the gas and we peeled out of the gas station parking lot, the figures receding into the distance behind us. We didn't stop, didn't look back, until we saw the lights of a small town on the horizon. We pulled into a diner parking lot, shaking, breathless, and scared out of our minds. Inside, the warmth and sound of life felt surreal. People, normal people, talking, laughing, The sheriff was there, sitting at the counter with 2 deputies. We stumbled inside and told them everything, every last horrifying detail. The sheriff and his deputies exchanged glances. It was a look I couldn't quite place, something between concern and disbelief. They offered to follow us back to the gas station, but we refused. No way in hell were we going back there. Eventually, they convinced us, promising they'd be right behind us the whole way. The headlights of the police trucks bathed the gas station in a stark, unforgiving light, illuminating what should have been impossible. The neon open sign was gone, the window shattered and grimy with years of neglect, and the paint on the building was peeling, weathered by decades of abandonment. The pumps that had been glowing just an hour before were nothing but rusted relics, standing like tombstones in the dead lot. My stomach churned. The sight before me was unreal. It couldn't be the same place. But it was. The road, the layout, the cracked pavement where I had parked the Jeep, it was all the same. Except now, it was as if time had caught up with it, revealing what had been hidden beneath the surface. Melissa stood beside me, trembling. Her face was pale, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "This can't be real." The sheriff and his deputies stepped out of their trucks, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they surveyed the scene. The sheriff turned to us, his weathered face creased with concern. "You sure this is the place?" I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. I could still see them in my mind. The black-eyed people, pressing their faces against the glass, their twisted smiles, the way the big man had slammed his fists against the door. I could still hear the girl's scream ringing in my ears. The sheriff looked around, his hand resting on his belt. He didn't say anything at first, just exchanged glances with his deputies before turning back to us. "Son," he said slowly, "this station's been closed for nearly 40 years. Ain't nobody been out here in a long time." I blinked, my mind struggling to make sense of what he was saying. No, that's not possible. We were just here. The lights were on. There were people. We saw them. The sheriff shook his head, glancing back at the dark, crumbling building. "I don't know what to tell you. This place is a ghost. Has been for decades. Closed down after the owner? Well, let's just say it didn't end well for him." A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to ask, but I had to know. "What happened to him?" The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck, his voice low and grim. "Old man ran the place by himself. Lived out back in a trailer. His wife had died years earlier. One night, some folks say they saw him out here, talking to people standing outside of his trailer door. He just disappeared after that night. No signs of foul play. No one ever found him, and the station's been shut ever since." The words sent a cold, creeping sensation up my arms. I turned to Melissa, who was staring at the gas station, her hands clenched at her sides. "The people we saw," she whispered, barely able to speak. "They were real. They were right here." The sheriff glanced at his deputies, who exchanged uneasy looks. "You kids sure you didn't see something else? You mentioned a long drive and it's late. Sometimes exhaustion can play tricks on your mind." "No," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "We didn't imagine it. They were real. They were trying to get inside the store. They asked for help, but..." I trailed off, remembering their black, soulless eyes. Their voices. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. Even I was beginning to doubt what I had seen, what we had experienced. It felt unreal now, standing there in front of the abandoned gas station, the night pressing in around us. The sheriff didn't argue, but I could tell from the look on his face that he didn't believe us. He gave us his card and told us to contact him if we remembered anything else. We thanked him, hollowly, before getting back into the Jeep. We didn't say much as we left the gas station, still running on adrenaline and fear. The air inside the Jeep was thick with an unspoken agreement. We needed to get far away from that place. Fast. We drove for a while in silence, the dark country roads winding beneath us, until we spotted the lights of the diner in the distance. The same diner we had passed earlier that night. It felt like a lifetime ago. When we pulled into the parking lot, the place looked exactly as it had when we first saw it, bright, bustling, and full of life. It was as if nothing in the world had changed, like we hadn't just experienced something completely out of this world. But Melissa and I had changed. We felt it. That gnawing sense of wrongness still clung to us. Inside the diner, we slid into a booth by the window. It was warm, the smells of frying bacon and fresh coffee filling the air. People were chatting, laughing, going about their lives like everything was normal. I felt like I was walking through a dream, detached from the reality around me. Melissa was staring at the menu, but I could tell she wasn't reading it. She hadn't said a word since we left the gas station. "What the hell just happened back there?" she whispered, finally breaking the silence between us. I shook my head, my fingers still trembling as I gripped the edges of the menu. "I don't know," I said, my voice low, "but I've never seen anything like that in my life. Those people, those things, they weren't right." Melissa's eyes were wide, still clouded with fear. She looked down at her hands, which were still shaking. "Their eyes, Cam. I can't stop thinking about their eyes. How can someone's eyes be black like that? It's not human." I swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. She was right. None of it was human. We quietly ordered something to eat, both of us not realizing until then how hungry we were. We ate our food in silence, our thoughts swirling with the events of the night. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more confused I became. Every time I thought about those black eyes, that sick, unnatural smile on the man's face, it made me feel like we'd barely escaped something far worse than we could comprehend. "I think we just need to get home," I said after a while, pushing my empty plate aside. "Let's just focus on that. We can figure out what happened later. Right now, we need to put some distance between us and whatever that was." Melissa nodded, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. "I don't think I can drive. I'm too shaken up." "I'll drive," I offered. "I've had 4 cups of coffee since we've been here. You can sleep if you need to." She handed me the keys without protest, and we got back into the Jeep. As I settled into the driver's seat and pulled out of the diner parking lot, the conversation died again. The only sound was the steady hum of the tires on the road, and Melissa's shallow breathing as she leaned her head against the window, her eyes fluttering closed. She was exhausted, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. Not after what we'd just been through. The drive back to our hometown was long and silent. Every mile we put between us and that gas station felt like a small victory, but the tension in the air never fully disappeared. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those black-eyed figures standing at the side of the road, watching us as we drove away. But there was nothing. Just the empty highway stretching out into the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we finally made it back to our city. The familiar streetlights and signs welcomed us like an old friend, and for the first time since the gas station, I felt like I could breathe again. We pulled into my driveway, and I stopped the Jeep. Neither of us moved at first, both staring straight ahead, lost in our thoughts. I knew this wasn't over. We couldn't just go back to normal after what had happened, but for now, we had to try. "I guess this is where I leave you," Melissa said quietly, her voice hoarse. I nodded, turning to look at her. "Yeah, I guess so. But let's meet up after Thanksgiving, okay? We need to figure out what happened." "Yeah, after Thanksgiving," she agreed, though her voice was distant. "We'll figure it out." I climbed out of the Jeep, grabbing my bag from the back seat. Melissa jumped over into the driver's seat. We looked at each other quietly. "Happy Thanksgiving, Melissa," I said softly. She gave me a weak smile. "Happy Thanksgiving." I watched as she pulled out of the driveway and drove away, her taillights disappearing into the distance. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the spot where the Jeep had been. My house was right there, safe and warm, with my family waiting inside, completely unaware of what I had just been through. I didn't tell them. Not a word. When I walked through the front door, my mom was already up, getting things ready for Thanksgiving. She greeted me with a hug, and for the first time in hours I felt grounded again. I was home. Thanksgiving felt like a surreal blur of warmth, food, and laughter. My family was all there, bustling around the kitchen, setting the table, talking about what they were grateful for. I ate more than I had in weeks, stuffing myself with turkey, mashed potatoes, and my mom's famous meatloaf. The conversation flowed, and for those few hours, I managed to push everything that had happened to the back of my mind. The night before felt like a bad dream, distant and disconnected from the cozy world around me. In some strange way, surviving that night made me appreciate everything more. The familiar smells of home, the laughter of my family, even the small mundane moments that I'd taken for granted before. It was one of the best Thanksgivings I'd ever had, maybe because I knew how close I had come to missing it. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, and for that day I let myself pretend it hadn't. But the peace didn't last. The next morning, while everyone was out braving the Black Friday shopping chaos, my phone buzzed. It was Melissa. "Can I come over?" she asked, her voice still shaky. I agreed, and about 10 minutes later she was at my door, looking as tired as I felt. We didn't say much as we headed to a nearby cafe. Both of us knew what we were there to do, figure out what the hell had happened to us. We sat in the back corner of the cafe, nursing cups of coffee as I opened my laptop. Together, we started searching for answers, trying to make sense of the nightmare we'd lived through. It didn't take long before we stumbled across the stories, dozens of them. The first thing we found was about the black-eyed children. The legends were similar to what we'd experienced, people reporting strange children knocking on their doors late at night, asking to be let in, their eyes completely black. The stories were eerie, but they didn't match what had happened to us exactly. For one, we hadn't just seen children. There had been adults too, a whole group of them. And none of the stories we found talked about anything on that scale. We kept digging, going deeper into the lore. Some mentioned black-eyed adults, but again, the details didn't line up with what we had experienced. The people in those stories seemed more like solitary figures, whereas we had been surrounded, hunted. Melissa leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. None of this explains why it happened, or how. I sighed, scrolling through another forum post. Maybe it was something else, like a time slip or a dimensional shift. Maybe we stepped into something that wasn't supposed to be there. Melissa looked at me, her expression tired but thoughtful. Like we were in the wrong place at the wrong time? Maybe. I shrugged. There's all kinds of theories about stuff like that. Places that are out of sync with time or reality. Maybe that gas station was, I don't know, stuck between worlds or something. She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. It's as good an explanation as anything else at this point. But honestly, Cam, the more we dig into this, the more questions we end up with. She was right. We left the cafe that afternoon with more questions than answers. No matter how much research we did, nothing could fully explain what had happened to us. The stories, the theories, they all came close, but none of them captured the sheer terror of that night. We knew we'd never get the full truth. Maybe it was better that way. When it was time to return to school, we both agreed on one thing: no more back roads. We stuck to the interstate, driving straight and steady the whole way, our eyes scanning the highway for anything out of the ordinary. But the trip back was uneventful, normal. It was like the night at the gas station had been an anomaly, something that didn't belong in our world and thankfully hadn't followed us back. After that, Melissa and I became inseparable. The bond we formed that night was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. We had shared something so terrifying, so unreal, that no one else could possibly understand. And that bond turned into something deeper. Our friendship grew, blossoming into a relationship as the months passed. By the time we graduated, we were completely in sync, and I proposed to her at our graduation ceremony, surrounded by friends and family. She said yes without hesitation. After college, we moved across the country to start our new lives together, determined to leave the past behind. We never talked about that night with anyone else. It became a secret we kept between us, something too strange to share. Occasionally, we'd discuss it in whispers late at night, but even then, it felt like opening a door we didn't want to walk through again. Now, 5 years later, we're just days away from our wedding. We're excited about our future, about our new life together. But as the day approaches, I find myself thinking about that night more often. It's something I've never been able to fully shake, and I realize now that I need to get it off my chest. So, this is my story. I'm sharing it here, on Reddit, with the blessing of Melissa. We agreed this will be the one and only time we ever speak of it to anyone else. After this, we'll close the book on it for good. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but if someone out there has experienced something similar, I hope this story helps. Maybe it's just a reminder that, whatever strange things are out there in the dark, we're not alone. And if you ever find yourself on a long, empty road late at night, with your gas light on and you see a gas station that seems too good to be true, maybe you shouldn't stop. Keep driving, and never, ever look back.